They thought I was just some pushover suburban dad they could steamroll, some quiet guy who spends too much time worrying about the pH balance of his lawn. But yesterday, three HOA enforcers made the single biggest mistake of their lives when they showed up at my door while I wasn't in Oppos. T home and decided to lay hands on my wife, leaving her shaking and bruised on our front steps. And when I finally stood face to face with their ringleader, a piece of work named Miller, he just smirked at my khakis and my school ID and asked me what I was going to do about it. Maybe give him a timeout or a gold star for effort. And God, it took every ounce of my self-control not to show him exactly what 14 years in the teams actually looks like when the end, quote, quiet teacher, end quote, stops pretending. You see, my name is Elias Thorne, and for the last 6 years, I've been living a lie that I worked very, very hard to build. A life where the most high-stakes thing I do is explain long division to fourth graders or negotiate who gets the red swing at recess. Because after a decade and a half of breathing in the dust of places the government doesn't in Oppos, T put on maps, all I wanted was peace, and I found it here in Oak Crest, Virginia. Or at least, I thought I did, until I realized this. Neighborhood wasn't in Oppos, T run by a community board, but by a pack of legalized mobsters hiding behind clipboards and clip-on ties. It all started on a Tuesday, one of those crisp mornings where the air smells like wood smoke, and everything feels right with the world. And I remember waving to old Mrs. Gable as she walked her retriever, thinking about how lucky I was to have Lily, my wife, who's the kind of woman who actually believes people are fundamentally good, which is probably why she didn't, and Oppos, TC the Sharks circling until it was too late. I was in my classroom, halfway through grading a stack of essays on, end quote, what I want to be when I grow up, end quote, when my phone buzzed with a text from Lily that just said, end quote, please come home now, end quote, and the lack of emojis or her usual, end quote, love you, end quote, sent a chill down my spine that I hadn't in Oppos. T felt since a night op in the Hindu Kush. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw her sitting on the porch, her face pale, holding a bag of frozen peas to a temple that was already turning, an ugly shade of plum, and her favorite cream-color blouse was torn at the shoulder, her breathing shallow and hitched like she'd been crying for an hour. She told me they came about a, end quote, fence height violation, end quote, 3 of them led by Miller, and when she tried to tell them the fence was professionally installed to code, they didn't end Oppos. T just argue, they got aggressive, they cornered her, and when she tried to step back inside, Miller grabbed her arm so hard he left finger-shaped. Bruises before shoving her backward down the concrete steps, standing over her while she bled and telling her that, end quote, suburban wives need to learn their place in the pecking order, end quote, if they don an Oppos. T want things to get, end quote, complicated, end quote, for their husbands. The ice that filled my veins in a moment was familiar, a cold, predatory clarity that I'd spent years trying to drown in craft beer and weekend gardening. And as I was cleaning the scrape on her elbow, I heard the heavy thud of an SUV door slamming out front, and I looked out the window to see a blacked-out Suburban parked crookedly across my lawn. 3 men stepped out, swaggering like they owned the zip code, wearing those tactical light polos that guys wear when they want to look like cops. But Kuden and Oppos, T passed the psych eval, and Miller was in the lead, a guy with a neck like a fire hydrant and eyes that only looked for things to break. I told Lily to go upstairs and lock the door, and the way she looked at me, the way her eyes widened when she saw the, end quote, teacher, end quote, mask slip off my face, told me she knew the man she married was gone, and the man the Navy built was standing in his place. I walked out onto the lawn, my hands loose at my sides, my breathing rhythmic and deep, watching them through the lens of threat assessment I didn't in Oppos, to even realize I was still running. 3 targets, primary is 230 pounds, lead heavy footing, probably has a concealed carry at the small of his back. The 2 wingmen are younger, twitchy, looking for a show. Miller didn't in Oppos. To even wait for me to speak, he just tapped his tablet and said, end quote, Thorne, we in Oppos. Re here to finish the inspection your wife was so in Oppos. Uncooperative in Oppos. About, and since you in Oppos, re the man of the house, maybe you can teach her some manners before we have to come back with a lien and sheriff, end quote. And he laughed that wet, arrogant sound of a man who's never been punched in the mouth for being a coward. One of the younger guys, a kid with a buzz cut named Tyler, leaned in and whispered, end quote, she's a real firecracker, Elias, Maybe she needs a little more in oppos, one-on-one in oppos, instruction from the enforcement team, end quote. And the way he licked his lips made the world go quiet, the kind of quiet that happens right before a flashbang goes off. I didn't oppos. TL, I didn't in oppos. T move an inch. I just looked Miller dead in the eye and said, end quote, you have 5 seconds to get off my property before this becomes a situation you aren't in oppos. T equipped to handle, end quote. And for a heartbeat, Miller actually looked confused, like he was trying to figure out why the, end quote, math teacher, end quote, wasn't in oppos. T shaking, but then his ego kicked back in, and he reached out to shove my shoulder the same way he'd shoved Lily. He didn't in oppos, to even see my hand. Move, it was just muscle memory, a CQC pivot I'd done 10,000 times in the dark, and before he could blink, his wrist was locked, his weight was channeled into the ground, and he was on his knees in the grass with his face inches from the dirt, his arms screaming in a way that told him his shoulder was a 1/4 inch from leaving its socket. His buddies froze, their hands hovering over their belts, but I didn't end oppos. To give them a second to think, I just leaned down and whispered into Miller's ear, end quote, I spent 14 years hunting people much smarter and much meaner than you in holes you couldn't in oppos. T fine with a map, so if you ever touch my wife or my property again, I want an oppos. To use a clipboard, I'll use every bit of the tax dollars the government spent turning me into a ghost to make sure you simply stop existing, end quote. I let him go, and the way they scrambled back into that SUV was almost pathetic, gravel spraying as they peeled out, but I knew it wasn't an oppos. T over, because guys like Miller are just the dogs on the leash, and I needed to find a hand holding it. That night, I didn't in oppos. T sleep, I just sat in my darkened office and started digging, using the old back doors and contacts I had in oppos. T touched since I turned in my trident, and what I found made my blood boil worse than the assault. Oakcrest wasn't oppos. T just a strict HOA. It was a systematic equity skimming operation run by a high-end law firm called Sterling & Amp. Associates, led by a man named Julian Sterling who sat on the board of half the charities in the state. They weren't in oppos. T just issuing fines. They were targeting homeowners who were behind on their mortgages or elderly folks with no heirs, hitting them with, end quote, non-compliance, end quote, fees that snowballed until the HOA could legally foreclose, then flipping the houses to a shell company Sterling owned for pennies on the dollar. They'd cleared $4 million in the last year alone, and Miller's, end quote, enforcement team, end quote, were just the thugs used to scare people into moving out without a fight. The next morning, Sterling himself called me, and his voice was like expensive silk, all calm and reasonable, telling me he'd heard there was a, end quote, regrettable misunderstanding, end quote, at my house, and that he was willing to, end quote, overlook, end quote, my assault on his staff if I just paid a $5,000, end quote, nuisance fee, end quote, and sign a non-disclosure agreement. He told me he knew about my service, or at least the parts he could find, and he subtly hinted that a man with my, end quote, history of violence, and, quote, wooed in oppos, T want the school board finding out he was a, end quote, liability, end quote, to the children. He thought he was holding a winning hand, thought he could use my piece as a weapon against me, but he forgot that a seal doesn't and oppos. T just defend. He goes on the offensive. I spent the next 48 hours working the neighborhood, not as a teacher, but as a handler, meeting with Mrs. Gable, the retired accountant 2 doors down, and the young couple across the street who'd been crying over a $10,000 fine for their, end quote, unapproved, end quote, driveway. I showed them the paper trail, the shell companies, the photos of Sterling meeting with Miller at a strip club in the city, and I watched as the fear in their eyes turned into the same cold fire I was carrying. The climax came at the Tuesday night board meeting, held in the community center's gymnasium under those flickering fluorescent lights, and Sterling was up there at the podium, looking regal in his charcoal suit, ready to vote on a new, end quote, security assessment, end quote, that would have doubled everyone's dues. He saw me walk in the back door, and he actually smiled, a predatory little twitch of the lips, thinking I was there to hand over a check, but then I wasn't in oppos. T the only one. Behind me came 50 residents, all of them silent, all of them carrying folders I printed out for them. I didn't in oppos. T wait for my turn to speak. I just walked right up to the front, dropped a thumb drive on the table in front of the court reporter, and looked at the hidden camera I'd noticed in the corner of the room, the one Sterling used to record his, end quote, victories. End quote. End quote. Julian, end quote. I said, and the room went so quiet you could hear the hum of the vending machine in the hall. End quote. You told me that people would be afraid of a man with my background, that they'd see a monster. But what you didn't in Oppos, T realizes that these people aren't in Oppos. T afraid of the guy who protects them. They're afraid of the guy who steals from them while they sleep. End quote. I pointed to the screen as the projector flared to life, showing his own internal emails discussing the quote, Oak Crest liquidation project, end quote, and a recording of Miller bragging about shoving my wife. The color drained out of Sterling's face so fast I thought he was going to faint, and when he tried to gavel me down, Mrs. Gable stood up and told him to sit his, end quote, thieving ass, end quote, back down. The police were already waiting in the parking lot. Not the ones Sterling had on his payroll, but the state investigators I'd spent all night feeding digital evidence to. Watching them lead Sterling and Miller out in zip ties while the entire neighborhood cheered was the most, end quote, educational, end quote, moment of my career. But as I walked Lily back to the car, her hand tucked firmly into mine, I realized that the, end quote, quiet life, end quote, I wanted was never about hiding who I was. It was about using who I was for the right reasons. The HOA board was disbanded. The fines were vacated, and Sterling's law license was shredded before the month was out. But it leaves me wondering about the world we live in. We all want to believe that if we mind our own business and water our lawns, the world will leave us alone. But sometimes the monsters dawn into Oppos. T live in caves. They live in the office at the end of the block and wear a suit. So I want to ask you guys, if someone came for your home, your family, or your dignity hiding behind a, end quote, rulebook, end quote, and a badge they didn't in Oppos, T-Earn, how far would you go to stop them? Do you think I went too far by using my, end quote, old life, end quote, to settle a suburban score? Or is the only way to deal with a bully to show them exactly what they're actually up against? Drop a comment below. I really want to know where you draw the line between being a good neighbor and being a sheep. And hey, if you've got an HOA horror story of your own, let's hear it. Maybe it's time we all started looking a little closer at who's running the neighborhood. Would you like me to elaborate on the specific legal steps Elias took to dismantle the shell companies? Or perhaps create a follow-up scenario where the community reacts to his revealed past?